Hi, Rhema. It's week 42, day 3 of our Bible narrative reading plan. Today we are in Luke chapter 14. And Luke 14, verse 1 sets the context. It sets the scene for everything that we see here in chapter 14. It says, one Sabbath, when he, that is Jesus, went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. So all of these teachings, these parables that we see here in Luke 14, they were all given in the same setting when Jesus is dining at the house of one of the Pharisees. But we quickly see that the invitation extended to Jesus was not because they sincerely wanted to hear his teaching. They're here to watch him carefully. They've set a trap for Jesus. They have a man, verse 2, who is there with dropsy. Dropsy seems to be a condition during that day where fluid is retained in the body. Perhaps it has to do with kidney failure or even cancer. But the point is that there's a man here. He's been set up. He's been left there to see whether or not Jesus will heal him on the Sabbath. Now, we see Jesus healing on the Sabbath many times in the Gospels because his point, his emphasis is that the Sabbath was made for man, not man made for the Sabbath. And so Jesus drives this point home to them. He asks them, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And they won't answer. And so Jesus heals the man. And then he looks at them and says, which one of you, if your son was injured or your ox was in the ditch, would you not immediately help him even on the Sabbath? And they're speechless. They won't answer. Jesus says, well, if you won't talk, I will. And he begins to teach them. Notice that each of these parables, the beginning of us tells us who he's talking to. He's covering everybody there at the banquet. Verse 7 says, now he told a parable to those who were invited. All of the guests here at the feast that Jesus is at, dining at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, he speaks to them and he gives them a parable about a wedding feast. And he again teaches something we just looked at with yesterday's reading. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. A repeated theme in Jesus' teaching. But then he turns to the man who had invited him, the owner of the house, the one who's throwing the party, and he gives a short parable just to him. And we see that there in verses 12 through 14. But then when verse 15, when one of those who was reclined at table, one specific guest, he hears these things from Jesus, and he just kind of smiles and says, well, blessed is everyone who will eat in the kingdom of God. But we can assume that he's thinking, just like all the other Jews during this time, that only Jews will be eating bread in the kingdom of God. And so Jesus turns on him and he gives another parable, and he makes clear that the kingdom of God is for all people. He tells a parable of another man throwing a great banquet. Notice that all of these, as Jesus is at a banquet, he's giving them parables about a banquet. And he tells a parable of a man who's going to throw a great banquet, and he sends out invitations to many people that you would expect to be invited to a banquet like this, but they make excuses. Insincere excuses of why they can't and won't come. And so the man broadens the net and he says, go to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring them the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame, the people that you would not expect to be at the great banquet. And then there's still room left over. And so the master says to the servant, go out to the highways and the hedges and compel, not force, but plead with and urge people to come in so that my house may be filled. And of course, we understand that Jesus is saying, look, I came to my people Israel, and they made up insincere excuses. They should be at the feast at the kingdom of God, but they have rejected their Messiah. And so Jesus has gone out to us Gentiles, people who don't deserve to be at the banquet, people you would not expect to be at the banquet. We are the lame and the blind and the poor and the crippled, but Christ has compelled us to come in. He's invited us to his banquet. And so we understand that the kingdom of God is for all people, but there's a cost of discipleship. Jesus turns in verse 25. Now great crowds accompanied him, the crowds who are following him in his ministry. And Jesus turns and he reminds them of the cost of discipleship, of what it means to really follow after Jesus. Is that what you're doing today? I pray that it is. Here's a summary of today's reading. For more information, go to tunemyheart.org.